Tonight, we uncover a story so shocking it was never meant to be told, a tale buried beneath centuries of doctrine, whispered in secret texts, hidden in manuscripts no one was allowed to read. For 2,000 years, Judas has been cast as the ultimate betrayer. But what if that image was crafted, carefully controlled, and enforced by those who held the power to shape memory itself? This isn't just about one man or a single act of betrayal. It's about the control of history, the rewriting of morality, and the silencing of voices that dared to tell a different truth. Every coin, every gesture, every word may have been misinterpreted, edited, or hidden to maintain a narrative that served authority, not truth. Behind closed doors, in vaults that even scholars cannot fully access, the Vatican has preserved fragments of a history that challenges everything we were taught to believe. Texts that recast Judas not as a villain, but as the chosen disciple, the one who carried out the hardest obedience. A story too dangerous to surface for centuries. So, before you dismiss this as legend, ask yourself, what if the betrayal we were taught to hate was a lie? What if history, faith, and morality have been carefully curated to hide a deeper truth? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step into the forbidden history of Judas and the truth that was never meant to be found. It was a quiet night in the garden. The air hung heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of footsteps approaching. Torches flickered in the distance, shadows stretched long across the ground. And then, with a single kiss, the fate of the world was sealed. This is the moment we have all been told to despise, the infamous kiss of Judas, the ultimate act of betrayal. But what if that kiss was not what we think it was? What if the moment that turned one man into history's most hated figure was rewritten to hide something far more unsettling? Imagine standing there under the olive trees, the darkness pressing in, knowing soldiers are on their way. The man you call master turns to you, not with anger, but with a look of certainty, as if he knows exactly what is about to unfold. He whispers a task, a command no one else dares to take, and you are the one chosen to carry it out. Would that kiss still be treachery, or would it be obedience to a destiny written long before that night? For nearly 2,000 years, Judas has been branded the villain, the one who sold his teacher for 30 pieces of silver. His name became the very word for traitor. Yet the story we are told leaves cracks if you look closely. If Jesus predicted his own betrayal, if he knew it had to happen, then was Judas truly acting against him, or was he fulfilling a role only he could play? The Gospels describe the kiss as the sign that led the guards to arrest Jesus, but the details grow thinner the deeper you look. Why would soldiers need a kiss to identify a man who had preached in temples, who had entered Jerusalem with crowds cheering his name? Why would the kiss be necessary at all, unless it symbolized something more? Unless it was not a mark of betrayal, but a gesture of trust exchanged in the final hour. This is where history blurs into silence. We are told Judas fell into despair, that he ended his life in shame, but other texts, long hidden, whisper another possibility. That Judas was not a villain, but the most loyal disciple of all, carrying out an unbearable mission so that prophecy could unfold. A kiss that looked like treachery on the outside, but within held the weight of sacrifice. Why would the world need Judas to remain the betrayer? Because if the worst man in Scripture is actually the most faithful, the entire balance of guilt and salvation shifts. The church would lose its perfect villain, and with it, the simple story that kept generations obedient. The kiss becomes not a curse, but a key, unlocking a version of history that changes everything we thought we knew about faith, loyalty, and truth. Tonight we begin where the story of betrayal begins, not to clear Judas's name, but to ask a question buried beneath centuries of silence. Was the kiss in the garden the darkest act in history, or was it the greatest act of obedience ever hidden? The story of Judas that most of us know did not come from scattered voices or multiple traditions. It came from the canonical Gospels, the 4 texts chosen by the early church to define who Jesus was and what his followers represented. Within those pages, Judas was not just a disciple who faltered. He was written as the villain, the traitor, the one who exchanged loyalty for silver. His actions became a symbol so powerful that his name itself was transformed into a curse. But when you step back and ask how this image was built, you begin to see that Judas was not simply remembered. He was constructed. In the Gospel of Matthew, Judas is portrayed as greedy, returning the 30 coins in regret, but too late to undo his choice. In the Gospel of Mark, he acts as the shadowy figure whose betrayal sets the passion into motion. Luke adds a darker twist, saying Satan entered him before the betrayal, making Judas not just weak but possessed. And in John's Gospel, the harshest account of all, Judas is painted as a thief, a liar, and the embodiment of evil. 4 voices, 4 angles, but together they lock Judas into one role, the permanent villain of the Christian story. It is striking how little space is given to his thoughts, his doubts, or his humanity. Unlike Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times yet was forgiven and honored, Judas receives no redemption, no chance for reconciliation. His story ends in despair, his legacy cemented as the betrayer. From that point onward, church leaders had an enemy within their own circle to point to, a living warning that even those closest to Christ could fall into darkness. The lesson was simple: obey or risk becoming Judas. By the time the Gospels were copied and read across the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, this single portrayal was already becoming law. To question it was to question Scripture itself. Entire sermons were built on the image of Judas as traitor. His role was used to explain suffering, to warn against greed, and to keep believers in line. The church did not need multiple interpretations. It needed a villain that could stand forever. Judas became that villain. Over time, the portrayal deepened. Artists painted him with twisted features. Preachers described him as consumed by demons. His story was retold so often that his humanity faded, replaced by a mask of pure betrayal. It was not only about what Judas did, it was about what people needed him to be. The perfect example of failure, the eternal scapegoat for betrayal, and the reminder that sin always has a face. This is the villain we inherited, a character shaped not only by events, but by choices made centuries ago, choices about which texts would be preserved and which stories would be silenced. Judas was fixed into one role so tightly that any alternative version of him became heresy. And yet, buried beneath this inherited image, faint traces of another Judas remain, waiting to be heard. The question is whether we are ready to listen. The power of a name can outlast empires. Some names carry honor, others carry shame. But few names in history have been turned into a weapon as effectively as Judas. From the moment the Gospels were copied and preached, the word Judas ceased to be a name and became a sentence. To call someone Judas was to condemn them without trial, to brand them as a traitor no matter their truth. This transformation of a single name into a symbol of betrayal was not natural. It was carefully reinforced until no other meaning was possible. Think of how language works. Words carry memory. They pass judgment without explanation. To say Benedict Arnold is to mean traitor in American history. To say Quisling is to mean collaborator in World War II. Judas became the first of these living labels. His story, locked by the canon, shaped how generations used his name. Teachers, priests, rulers, and storytellers all repeated the same pattern. Betrayal had one face, and it bore the name Judas. By the Middle Ages, the word Judas was no longer even tied to the man himself. It was hurled at enemies, at rivals, at anyone suspected of disloyalty. Political leaders branded opponents as Judas to destroy their reputation. Preachers warned their congregations not to become Judas in their hearts. The label became stronger than the story. You no longer needed to explain betrayal. you only needed to whisper the name. This power also carried into culture and art. Painters placed Judas apart from the disciples, often darker, twisted, sometimes holding a purse of coins so the viewer never forgot his guilt. Plays and songs used Judas as the ultimate example of evil wrapped in human form. Even in everyday speech, to call someone a Judas was to stab at their honor. The name itself became a weapon, sharper than any blade. But what happens when a name is locked into one meaning forever? It erases the possibility of other truths. If Judas was seen only as the betrayer, no one would question why he acted as he did, what pressures he faced, or whether there was more to his role than silver and shame. The verdict was written into the language itself. To speak his name was to condemn him all over again. No one needed a new trial because the trial had been concluded centuries before, sealed not by evidence but by repetition. In this way, Judas was transformed from a man into a symbol, a convenient symbol that carried the weight of humanity's fear of betrayal. Every culture needs its scapegoat, the one who absorbs all blame so that others may feel safe. Judas filled that role perfectly, and the longer his name was used as a weapon, the harder it became to see the person behind it. This is how language fixed the verdict. Long before historians could examine forgotten texts, long before archaeologists unearthed ancient manuscripts, Judas had already been convicted by the way his name was spoken. A single word became a prison, not only for him, but for the truth that may still lie hidden behind the name. When we open the Bible today, it feels complete, whole, as if the story has always been exactly this way. But the truth is very different. The Bible is not a single book. It is a collection of writings chosen out of many, some accepted and others quietly pushed aside. For every gospel that survived, there were others that did not. Some were burned, some were hidden, some were branded heresy and locked away where no one could read them. These missing pages are not myths, they existed, and among them were accounts that spoke of Judas in ways that would shatter the image we were taught to believe. Imagine sitting in the 2nd century when followers of Jesus were still writing their memories, recording teachings, and passing scrolls from hand to hand. Not all of these scrolls agreed with each other. Some described Judas not as a villain, but as someone chosen for a role no one else would accept. Some suggested that his actions were not betrayal, but obedience to a plan only he and Jesus understood. But these voices were never allowed to become part of the official story. The church chose which writings would shape the faith, and the rest were silenced. Over time, those suppressed texts became legends, whispered about but never read. Centuries passed, and only fragments survived. A line here, a passage there, sometimes discovered in remote deserts where monks had hidden them away. Each fragment was like a spark, showing us that the story of Judas may have once looked very different. These sparks suggest that there was never just one version of the man. There were many, and the darkest one was the one chosen to remain. The hunt for these missing pages is like chasing shadows. In the 20th century, when the Gospel of Judas surfaced in a dusty Coptic manuscript, the world caught a glimpse of the version that had been buried. In that text, Judas is not the enemy. He is the only disciple who understands. He does not betray Jesus out of greed. He fulfills a request that no one else could bear. It is a shocking reversal. It forces us to ask why such a text would be hidden. Why would the church want this story gone unless it threatened the foundation of everything they had built? If Judas could be seen as loyal, then guilt and salvation are no longer simple. If the greatest villain could also be the most obedient, then the story of sin and forgiveness loses its neat lines. That is the power of the missing pages. They do not just add detail, they change the entire shape of the story. And that is why they were never meant to be read. Yet, they still surface. From caves in Egypt to monasteries in the Middle East, fragments continue to appear. Each one is a reminder that history is never as final as we think. The missing pages wait in silence, but silence does not erase truth. it only delays it. And when that truth returns, it can rewrite everything we thought we knew about Judas, about Jesus, and about the power that chose which voices would survive. The desert holds secrets better than any vault. Beneath its endless sands lie stories sealed away for centuries, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. In the middle of the 20th century, a shepherd in Egypt stumbled across clay jars hidden in a cave near a place called Nag Hammadi. Inside were manuscripts untouched since the early days of Christianity. These texts, written in Coptic, told stories that did not match the ones we were taught. They spoke of visions, hidden teachings, and voices that the official church had long tried to erase. Some even whispered a different role for Judas, one far removed from the traitor carved into our memory. Why were these manuscripts buried in the desert in the first place? Because the early centuries of Christianity were not a time of unity. They were a battlefield of ideas. Dozens of groups wrote down what they believed Jesus had taught. Some emphasized secret knowledge. Some spoke of inner awakening. Others insisted that salvation came only through faith in the church. To those in power, not all voices were welcome. Writings that challenged the growing authority of bishops were labelled dangerous. Once the Council of Nicaea and later councils began shaping doctrine in the 4th century, anything that did not align was condemned as heresy. But scrolls cannot be erased as easily as sermons. Monks and believers who cherished these alternative gospels knew they were at risk of being destroyed, so they hid them. They sealed them in jars and buried them in caves far from the reach of authority. They trusted the desert to guard them in silence until another age might rediscover them. And the desert kept its promise. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library changed the way historians view the early church. Suddenly it became clear that Christianity had never been a single voice. It had been a chorus, loud, conflicting, diverse. Among the manuscripts were Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene. Each one gave glimpses of teachings that emphasized knowledge, choice, and direct experience of the divine. If such voices had been allowed to survive in the mainstream, the role of Judas might also have been understood differently. Instead of one villain, he may have been seen as part of a deeper mystery. The desert whispers remind us that silence is not the same as absence. For centuries, the church told the world that the story was complete, that no other gospels mattered. Yet, the jars hidden in caves prove otherwise. Someone believed these writings were worth saving. Someone believed future generations needed to hear them, even if it meant risking everything to preserve them. Every fragment discovered is a crack in the wall of official history. They do not answer every question about Judas, but they hint at a world where his story was never meant to be one-dimensional. Perhaps more manuscripts still lie buried, their voices waiting to return. And when they do, the whispers from the desert may become a roar that no authority can silence. In the year 1978, a group of Egyptian farmers stumbled upon a limestone box in the desert near El Minya. Inside was a manuscript written in Coptic, fragile and broken, its pages eaten away by time. At first, it looked like just another fragment of early Christian writing, but as scholars began to study it, they realized they were holding something that could shake the foundation of everything people thought they knew about Judas. This was the Gospel of Judas, a text that dared to tell the story from a completely different angle. Unlike the Gospels in the Bible, this manuscript did not brand Judas as a greedy traitor or a coward. Instead, it portrayed him as the only disciple who truly understood Jesus. In this account, Jesus laughs at the others, who pray to a false god and fail to grasp his message. Only Judas is given the secret knowledge. Only Judas is entrusted with the role no one else would take. According to this gospel, it is not betrayal when Judas delivers Jesus to the authorities. It is obedience. Jesus tells him directly, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." The meaning is clear. Judas is helping free the divine spirit by releasing Jesus from his human body. This changes everything. If Judas acted not out of greed but out of faith, then the darkest figure in Christian memory suddenly becomes the most loyal disciple. The kiss in the garden is no longer a curse, but a sign of trust. The 30 pieces of silver are no longer proof of corruption, but the price of a destiny no one else could carry. This gospel flips the story upside down and forces us to ask if Judas was chosen not to fail, but to succeed in the most painful way imaginable. The manuscript's journey after its discovery was filled with irony. For years it was hidden again, traded on the black market, even locked away in a safe deposit box in New York where humidity nearly destroyed it. Only in the early 2000s did restoration efforts finally bring its words back into the light. When the translation was published in 2006, the world was stunned. For the first time, the voice of Judas was heard in a way that did not condemn him but honored him. The reaction from the church was quick and cautious. Some dismissed the text as Gnostic heresy, written too late to matter. Others admitted it was valuable historically, but insisted it did not change doctrine. Yet, beneath those careful statements lay a quiet fear, because if Judas could be seen as faithful, then centuries of teaching, preaching, and blaming would collapse in an instant. The church would lose the villain it had relied on for nearly 2 millennia. The Gospel of Judas does not erase the pain of betrayal, but it suggests that what looked like betrayal may have been something else entirely. A necessary act carried out in silence, chosen by Jesus himself. If that is true, then Judas was not the enemy of Christ. He was his most trusted friend. And if that truth was buried for so long, one has to wonder what else still lies hidden in the sands, waiting to emerge. In the world of faith, there are acts of devotion that inspire songs and paintings. Then there are acts of obedience so heavy that no one would ever choose them unless commanded. According to the Gospel of Judas, Jesus did not view Judas as a traitor, but as the one disciple capable of carrying the hardest obedience. The story suggests that what looked like betrayal was not treachery at all, but a sacred necessity, a role that demanded absolute trust between teacher and student. Imagine sitting among the 12, listening to Jesus speak of mysteries that even the closest friends cannot understand. Most disciples hear only parables and riddles. They argue, they misunderstand, they cling to the image of a worldly kingdom, but Judas is set apart. He is the one Jesus takes aside. He is the one entrusted with the secret that his death is not defeat but release. It is in that moment that Judas learns the terrible truth. Someone must hand over the body of Jesus so that the spirit may be set free. That someone must be him. The weight of that command is almost unbearable. To betray is to be hated by all, remembered as cursed, stripped of honor forever. To obey means to accept being cast out not only by enemies, but by friends. Yet Judas accepts it. He takes the burden no one else would carry. In this theology, Judas is not the coward who sells his master for silver. He is the chosen one, the disciple brave enough to sacrifice his own name for the sake of the mission. This vision turns the story inside out. Instead of being the greatest sinner, Judas becomes the greatest servant. The kiss in the garden is no longer a symbol of betrayal, but a final act of loyalty, a signal agreed upon in secret between teacher and chosen. The payment of silver is not the motive but the cover, a way to mask the truth behind ordinary greed. It is a story of hidden obedience disguised as treachery. What makes this idea so unsettling is how it redefines loyalty. True loyalty, in this light, is not about protecting a reputation or staying in the comfort of approval. It is about obedience to truth even when the world misunderstands. It is about choosing a path that will make you look guilty so that something greater can be accomplished. Judas becomes the silent hero whose reward is not glory but eternal shame. He chooses to lose everything so that prophecy can unfold. The church could never allow this interpretation to stand. If Judas was faithful, then the neat division between saint and sinner collapses. The authority to declare who is saved and who is damned begins to crumble. A faith built on simple categories of good and evil would suddenly face questions too complex to control. And so this version of Judas was buried, replaced with the villain we all inherited. Yet the theology of the teacher and the chosen still lingers in forgotten texts, reminding us that sometimes the greatest act of obedience is the one no one else will ever honor. And perhaps that is the true reason Judas was chosen. Not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to bear the weight of being hated forever. When we open the Bible today, it feels as if the book fell from the sky, complete and unquestioned. But the truth is, the Bible was not born whole. It was built piece by piece through choices made by councils of men who decided which writings would survive and which would vanish. These decisions were not neutral. They were shaped by politics, by fear, and by the desire to create one united voice for a church that was still fighting to control its future. And in that process, there was no room for a Judas who could be redeemed. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire was shifting. Christianity, once persecuted, was becoming the official faith of the empire. But the faith was fractured. Different groups followed different gospels. Some taught that Jesus was purely divine. Others insisted he was fully human. Some groups honored Mary Magdalene as a close disciple. Others erased her voice entirely. And then there were texts that dared to present Judas in a new light. To a church desperate for unity, such diversity was chaos. They needed a single canon, one book, one story that could silence all others. The Council of Nicaea, in the year 325, did not finalize the Bible, but it set the stage for what was to come. Over the next decades, bishops and leaders debated which books carried authority. The 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were chosen, while dozens of others were cast aside. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and later the Gospel of Judas were dismissed as heresy. Why? Because they challenged the picture the church needed to project. A loyal Judas would have made the neat drama of betrayal and salvation far more complex. And complexity was a danger to control. By fixing Judas as the ultimate traitor, the church secured a clear lesson for all believers. There would always be a villain to blame, a warning against questioning authority, a figure whose downfall proved the cost of disobedience. But if Judas had been included as faithful, the message would have shifted entirely. Suddenly betrayal would no longer be the worst sin. Suddenly obedience could look like rebellion. That was a risk no council could afford. So the canon was shaped not just by faith, but by power. Books that supported hierarchy, obedience, and the authority of bishops were kept. Texts that spoke of secret knowledge, personal awakening, or alternative versions of the disciples were buried or burned. And once the canon was fixed, it became untouchable. To question it was to question the church itself. This is why the story of Judas remained frozen. Not because all voices agreed, but because one version was chosen and the rest were silenced. The councils gave us a Bible, but they also gave us a filter, one that erased stories too dangerous for a world where the church needed control more than it needed truth. And hidden behind that filter is the possibility of a Judas we were never meant to meet. The word heresy was never just about belief. It was a weapon, a brand designed to mark certain ideas as dangerous and to silence the people who carried them. In the centuries after the death of Jesus, the early church faced many competing voices. Some Christians spoke of secret teachings passed quietly among disciples. Others described a vision of Judas that was not betrayal but loyalty. These voices could not be debated fairly, because debate would mean giving them space to exist. Instead, they were stamped with a single word, heresy. And once that word was spoken, the verdict was final. Heresy was not defined by truth or lies. It was defined by power. If a text or teaching threatened the authority of bishops, it became heretical. If it undermined the clean division between saint and sinner, it was outlawed. And if it suggested that Judas was more than a villain, that he might have been chosen for a sacred task, then it became the most dangerous idea of all. Because if Judas could be seen as faithful, the entire system of guilt, forgiveness, and obedience would begin to unravel. So the church used the word heresy like fire. Those labelled heretics were exiled, their communities scattered, their writings destroyed, whole libraries vanished. In some cases, scrolls were burned in public ceremonies meant to terrify anyone who still held them. The message was clear. To preserve these alternative memories was not simply wrong, it was a crime against God. And once a crime is defined as spiritual, there is no defense possible. You are guilty before the trial even begins. This is why so many texts about Judas disappeared, not because they lacked meaning, but because they carried too much of it. To allow people to believe that Judas obeyed Jesus would open a door the church could never close again. It would mean that obedience to truth might look like rebellion against authority. It would mean that salvation was not limited to those who followed the rules. And it would mean that the line between traitor and chosen was far thinner than leaders wanted anyone to realize. Labeling something heresy was a strategy by design. It created a map of safe and unsafe ideas, with bishops holding the only key. It turned curiosity into sin and made silence the safest choice. Over time, people forgot that there had even been other stories. They grew up believing Judas had always been a traitor, because every voice that suggested otherwise had been branded, erased, or burned. Yet whispers survived, manuscripts hidden in jars, fragments copied in secret, and rumours passed in small circles, all carried hints that Judas's story had once been more complicated. The fact that so much effort was spent destroying these memories only proves their power. Heresy was never about falsehood, it was about control, and by design, the church ensured that Judas would remain the eternal villain, while the possibility of his loyalty was locked away in shadows. Deep beneath the stone walls of the Vatican lies a place few have ever seen. Endless shelves stretch for miles, filled with manuscripts, letters, and records that date back over 1,000 years. This is the secret archive, a vault so heavily guarded that only select scholars are allowed to enter, and even then, only under strict rules. No free browsing, no wandering through stacks, only access to what you specifically request. It is a library of locked doors, and behind those doors could lie the missing pieces of history that would change everything we thought we knew. The very idea of such an archive raises questions. Why keep so much knowledge hidden? Why protect it from the public eye if it contains nothing but harmless history? The answer becomes clearer when we think of Judas. If manuscripts exist that paint him not as a traitor, but as a chosen disciple, the entire story of Christianity begins to shift. The church would lose its perfect villain. The line between obedience and betrayal would blur. And the faithful might begin to question whether other parts of the story were edited too. The archive is not simply storage, it is control. By keeping certain texts locked away, the church holds the key to history itself. It decides what can be remembered and what must remain forgotten. A rehabilitated Judas would destabilize centuries of teaching. Imagine sermons that for nearly 2,000 years warned believers never to be like Judas, suddenly being exposed as incomplete or even misleading. Imagine a world where Judas was seen as loyal, where his name no longer meant betrayal but sacrifice. The authority of the church would crack because its entire moral structure depends on that clear division. Over the centuries, rumours have circulated about what lies hidden in the stacks. Some say there are alternate gospels that contradict the canon. Others whisper of maps, ancient scientific writings, and documents that rewrite timelines. But the story of Judas is among the most threatening. Because if he was faithful, then salvation is not about blind obedience to an institution, but about trust in a truth larger than human judgment. and that is a message no power structure wants widely known. The locked stacks symbolize more than secrecy. They symbolize the fear of losing control over memory itself. Every page left unread keeps the official story safe. Every key withheld ensures that the past remains fixed. For the Church, protecting the image of Judas as the betrayer is not about one man. It is about protecting the narrative that allows them to define sin, guilt, and redemption. One day, those shelves may be opened fully. One day, the key may turn, and the pages hidden in darkness may see the light. If that happens, the figure of Judas will not rise as a villain, but as a question powerful enough to unravel centuries of doctrine. And that is why, for now, the archive remains closed. The story of the Gospel of Judas is not just the story of one text. It is the story of survival against impossible odds. For centuries, the Church worked to silence any alternative narratives that challenged the canonical Gospels. Manuscripts were burned, rewritten, or hidden. Libraries were scattered and forgotten. And yet, against all expectations, fragments of this Gospel refused to vanish. They survived in caves, in jars, in the hands of believers who risked everything to protect them. Imagine the desert in Egypt around the year 250. Monks and secret disciples copied texts under torchlight, their hands trembling from cold or fear. They knew that discovery could mean death. Yet they persisted, aware that the knowledge contained in these pages might one day change the understanding of the story forever. Every line they copied was a defiance of authority, a gamble with faith, a whisper that the truth could survive. Over the centuries, the manuscripts travelled. Some ended up in private collections, locked away from scholars. Others were forgotten in dusty attics, or miscatalogued in European libraries. Every relocation brought risk. Worms, water, fire, and human hands threatened to erase the text completely. And yet, each fragment endured, like a message in a bottle cast into the currents of time, waiting for someone to find it and read it. By the 20th century, the pieces of the Gospel of Judas had begun to emerge in fits and starts. Scholars pieced together fragments found in Egypt, in Coptic translation, reconstructing the text from shreds. The process was painstaking. Words had faded, pages were missing, and ink had bled over itself. And still, the story emerged, revealing a Judas unlike the one history had taught. He was not the villain. He was the confidant, the chosen one entrusted with the task no one else could bear. The resilience of this gospel speaks to something larger than a single manuscript. It is evidence that truth, even when suppressed, can endure. It also demonstrates the lengths institutions will go to control history. For every page preserved, there were countless others destroyed. The survival of the Gospel of Judas is improbable not because it was lucky, but because someone somewhere refused to allow it to die. Every copy made, every fragment hidden, was a quiet act of resistance. Today, when the text is available for study, it challenges the narrative handed down for centuries. Scholars can see a story where betrayal is recast as obedience, where the supposed villain is actually the one who understands the greatest mystery. And yet, even now, the gospel is treated cautiously. Its words are studied, analysed, and sometimes dismissed by institutions that fear its implications. Its survival is a reminder that history is never final, that stories buried for centuries can return to ask the questions we were never meant to hear. The Gospel of Judas refuses to die because it carries a truth too powerful to remain hidden forever. It reminds us that history is alive, that silenced voices will persist, and that sometimes the most dangerous text is the one that survives against all odds to tell a story the world was not ready to hear. Human societies have always needed someone to bear the blame, someone to represent the darkness, the greed, the failure that no one else wants to admit. In the Christian tradition, that figure became Judas. He is the mirror that reflects what people fear in themselves. He carries the weight of betrayal so that everyone else can remain morally tidy. By projecting evil onto a single figure, communities could simplify their own understanding of right and wrong, making morality clear and enforceable. Judas is more than a historical figure. He is a symbol, a psychological tool that shapes behavior. When people hear his story, they are warned against selfishness, greed, and disloyalty. They are taught that one wrong move can have consequences beyond comprehension. His name becomes shorthand for everything that is dangerous in human character. And over centuries, that projection grew so powerful that the man himself disappeared, leaving only the idea of betrayal. Societies rely on villains because they create boundaries. Without a clear enemy, morality becomes murky. The narrative of Judas allowed generations of believers to identify sin in themselves and in others. They could point to the ultimate example of failure and believe that by avoiding his path, they were safe. This made communities more cohesive, more obedient, and less likely to question authority. The lesson was simple: follow the rules, remain faithful, and never be like Judas. The myth of Judas also served the church. By making him the eternal betrayer, they could enforce teachings without debate. People believed in the story so completely that questioning it felt dangerous. Judas's image kept believers aligned with doctrine and discouraged independent thought. Over time, this projection became so ingrained that it shaped art, literature, and culture. Painters gave him dark clothing, twisted expressions, and isolation from the disciples. Playwrights made him scheming and greedy. Every representation reinforced the same moral message. Yet when we look beneath the myth, the psychology becomes clearer. Projecting evil onto a single figure is convenient. It allows people to distance themselves from the darker aspects of their own behavior. It creates a scapegoat who absorbs guilt and fear. And it is why a rehabilitated Judas is so threatening. If he is not the villain, then the moral mirror shatters. Suddenly, believers must face the possibility that the capacity for betrayal exists within themselves, and that obedience may take forms no one taught them to recognize. Judas the Mirror shows us that morality in human societies is often built on stories, not facts. He is both a warning and a shield. For centuries, he was blamed for humanity's sins, for the crucifixion, and for the chaos that followed. And in being blamed, he allowed the rest of the world to feel safe, to feel righteous, to feel in control. But the mirror can be broken. When the truth about Judas emerges, it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What if evil is not a single person, but a possibility within us all? What if loyalty and betrayal are not as simple as we were taught? The mirror of Judas reflects not just him, but ourselves. The story of Judas is often told in numbers: 30 pieces of silver, 3 days until the resurrection, 12 disciples surrounding a table. Numbers create order and certainty. They make the story digestible, and they give the appearance of meaning. But they also obscure what is hidden beneath the surface, the mystical core of the events. By focusing on the coins Judas received, society turned a complex act into a ledger entry. Betrayal was counted like money, neat and simple, and the deeper truth was buried beneath arithmetic. 30 pieces of silver. The church emphasized the sum, repeating it so that it became symbolic of greed, corruption, and moral failure. People learned to see the transaction, not the intention. The mystical significance of the act was forgotten. What if those coins were not a payment for betrayal, but a marker, a code, a ritual signal between teacher and chosen? The story becomes richer, more complex, and far less convenient for a church that wanted clarity. Numbers, in this case, became a tool for control, turning spiritual mystery into moral bookkeeping. Beyond the coins, numerology is woven throughout the gospel narratives. 3 represents divine completion, 12 represents the community of the faithful, 40 represents a period of trial. These numbers create patterns that hint at hidden knowledge, but in the case of Judas, they are used to simplify him. By counting him as one of 12, by measuring his silver, the story reduces a human being and his difficult obedience to a formula. Ledger book morality replaces nuance. The soul becomes a tally, not a journey. The focus on counting distracts from the spiritual dimension of the events. Judas is often seen as a villain who made a choice driven by greed. But when we look closer, his actions could be part of a sacred calculation, a fulfillment of prophecy that required precision and courage. The mystical core of the story is not about silver or sin alone. It is about the intersection of obedience, knowledge, and cosmic design. Numbers alone cannot capture that. For centuries, the simplicity of numbers helped enforce the image of Judas as the ultimate traitor. Teachers and preachers repeated the figures. Artists depicted him with coins in hand. The message was clear. Sin can be measured. Betrayal can be quantified. The spiritual complexity, the courage it might have taken to accept a role ordained by Jesus, was erased. Ledger book morality replaced the mystical story, turning a profound act into a cautionary tale of greed. Yet the numbers themselves contain secrets if we are willing to look. Hidden patterns, connections between dates, coins, and rolls suggest a deeper structure. Judas may have been performing the hardest obedience, working within a plan that transcended human understanding. Counting silver and souls was the surface story, but the true mathematics of betrayal is not addition or subtraction. It is timing, intention, and the courage to carry a destiny that no one else could bear. History remembers the crucifixion as the moment of ultimate betrayal, a story of innocence undone by one man's greed. But what if we look closer and see a different plot unfolding, one written in prophecy, one that required a hand willing to do what no one else could? According to the Gospel of Judas, the crucifixion was not a failure, but a necessary step in a divine plan. Someone had to open the gate, release the Spirit, and ensure that the purpose of Jesus' mission was fulfilled. That hand, vilified for centuries, may have been chosen for a task only it could complete. Imagine standing in the garden in Jerusalem, the night of betrayal. The air is thick with anticipation. Soldiers approach, torches flicker in the distance, and the disciples are frozen with fear. All but one understands. Judas knows that what he is about to do is both terrible and sacred. His act is seen by others as the gravest crime, but in reality, it is obedience to a plan foretold. He is not acting against Jesus, he is acting for him. This flips the story we have been told for centuries. If the crucifixion is the necessary step to open the gate, then Judas is not a villain. He is the instrument chosen to make the prophecy real. The vilified hand becomes the chosen one, carrying out the act that ensures the world receives a revelation that otherwise would have been impossible. Betrayal becomes a form of courage, an act of faith beyond comprehension. The implications are enormous. If one man must take on the role of sinner to save the world, then morality is more complex than good versus evil. The story is no longer a simple warning about greed. It becomes a meditation on destiny, responsibility, and the hidden tasks that few are strong enough to bear. Judas, long condemned as the ultimate villain, is recast as the indispensable participant in a sacred drama. Throughout the centuries, this narrative has been buried. Scholars and church authorities have ignored texts that paint Judas as the faithful disciple. Art, sermons, and literature have reinforced his guilt, leaving the public imagination convinced of his betrayal. Yet, the Gospel of Judas and related manuscripts hint that the real story was far more subtle. Prophecy required someone to act in a way the world could not understand. That someone was him. When we strip away the moralistic layers added over centuries, we see a plot designed to save the world, not destroy it. Judas's hand opens the gate, his actions create the path, and the crucifixion fulfills what had been foretold long before the first coins were counted. The vilified hand and the chosen one may be one and the same. Understanding this changes everything we think we know about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true mechanics of divine plans. The plot that saves the world is not written in sword or fire. It is written in trust, obedience, and the courage to be misunderstood. And for centuries, that truth was hidden behind centuries of condemnation. Only now, as we rediscover the texts, do we begin to glimpse the hand that was never meant to be blamed but honoured. What terrifies institutions more than rebellion is mercy. The idea that even the worst among us can act with purpose, that a figure long condemned could be absolved, strikes at the heart of control. Judas has always been the ultimate example of guilt. His betrayal has justified countless sermons, reinforced doctrines, and allowed authorities to claim the power to assign sin and forgiveness. But if he is absolved, if his actions are seen as necessary rather than wicked, then the entire structure of guilt and absolution begins to tremble. Consider what it means for a society to believe that some sins are unforgivable. It creates a hierarchy of morality, a framework in which authority defines who is guilty and who can be redeemed. The Church has long relied on this principle. The Judas narrative gave believers a figure to hate, a cautionary tale, and a way to understand obedience. But if the same hand that committed the ultimate act of betrayal is recognized as carrying out divine instruction, then sin itself becomes unstable. Mercy enters the story where once only punishment existed. The fear is not theological alone, it is practical and institutional. Institutions survive by controlling the rules, by defining who may stand forgiven and who must be condemned. If a man branded the traitor of all time is rehabilitated, the monopoly on moral judgment fractures. Ordinary believers may begin to question the absolution offered to others. Priests and rulers may be seen as gatekeepers, not of truth, but of narrative. And once that perception spreads, authority becomes vulnerable. The Gospel of Judas hints at this possibility. It does not erase betrayal, but it reframes it. Judas's act was necessary, chosen, even sacred. He is not condemned in the text, but honoured for the courage required to carry out a task no one else could. This interpretation terrifies because it removes certainty. It suggests that the ultimate judgment cannot be dictated by men alone, and that even acts labelled evil may serve a higher purpose. Throughout history, attempts to suppress this version of Judas show the intensity of the fear. Manuscripts were hidden, burned, or dismissed. Scholars who explored alternative narratives were marginalized. The possibility that the worst could be necessary was too dangerous to allow. It threatened to dissolve the rigid dichotomies that gave authority its power. The lesson was clear. If mercy exists for Judas, it could exist for anyone, and the control of guilt would no longer be absolute. This is the fear of mercy. It is why the narrative of Judas as villain has persisted for nearly 2,000 years. It is easier to teach obedience through condemnation than to embrace the complexity of necessary acts and hidden courage. But understanding mercy in Judas's story opens the door to a deeper truth about power, forgiveness, and human understanding. The absolution of the vilified disrupts control, challenges certainty, and reminds us that the most profound acts are often the ones least understood. If Judas can be absolved, then guilt is no longer owned by institutions. If the worst can be necessary, the world learns that judgment and forgiveness are not privileges of authority, but elements of a larger, more mysterious order. And that is a truth powerful enough to terrify anyone who relies on fear to maintain control. Art has always spoken in whispers. In the quiet halls of cathedrals, in the flickering light of candles, painters conveyed ideas that could not be spoken aloud. During the medieval and Renaissance periods, every colour, gesture, and gaze was carefully chosen. And when it came to Judas, some artists smuggled ambiguity into sacred scenes, hinting at truths that the Church would not openly allow. These were subtle signals, meant for those who could read them. hidden within the familiar story of betrayal. Look at a painting of the Last Supper. Judas is often separated from the other disciples, placed at the edge of the table. His face might be shadowed, his expression unreadable. At first glance, he appears guilty, isolated. But on closer inspection, some painters positioned him with subtle gestures that suggest knowledge rather than malice. Perhaps he leans in closer to Jesus, his hand poised not in greed but in readiness. The placement and posture become a code, a secret message embedded in plain sight. Colours also carried meaning. Red might symbolize sin, yes, but it could also signify divine energy or the burden of destiny. A painter who draped Judas in muted or unusual tones was speaking to those who knew how to interpret the language of pigment. Gold or white near his hands could hint at his chosen role, a secret honour hidden beneath centuries of condemnation. To the public, he was the villain. To the initiated, he was the faithful executor of a sacred plan. The gaze of figures in these paintings is equally important. Judas often meets the eyes of Jesus in a moment too brief to notice. This look can suggest communication, understanding, or even a shared secret. It is subtle, easily overlooked, but powerful. Artists knew that showing Judas as purely evil would please authorities. Showing him as complex or necessary would endanger their careers. So they created ambiguity, a silent rebellion encoded in brushstrokes. Symbols appear in objects and surroundings as well. Coins, bags, shadows, or small animals may hold layers of meaning. A purse of silver could signal betrayal or be a mark of ritual. The position of feet, the tilt of a head, even the direction of light could all hint at a hidden narrative. Painters were not just artists, they were storytellers, hiding forbidden history behind the acceptable. These hidden signals survived for centuries, waiting for eyes willing to see. Modern historians and art scholars now begin to decode these visual messages, discovering that artists preserved a version of Judas that was more complex, more human, and in some cases, more loyal than the text imposed by the church. The images quietly resisted the narrative that demanded he be the eternal traitor. Art that knew too much proves that stories do not disappear completely, even under centuries of suppression. Painters preserved ambiguity, hiding truth within colour, placement, and gaze. In their work, Judas is not simply a villain. He is a mirror, a confidant, a participant in a plan so intricate that only careful observation can reveal it. The brush became a key, and those who knew how to read it could glimpse a version of history the world was not meant to see. For centuries, control over what people could read was control over what they could think. The church recognized early that knowledge carried power, and that ideas, once spread, could challenge authority. That is why forbidden lists, known as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, were created. Books deemed dangerous, heretical, or misleading were banned. For nearly 400 years, from the mid-16th century until 1966, these lists dictated which texts were safe for the faithful. Among the writings suppressed were those that offered alternative views of Judas, presenting him not as the eternal traitor, but as the chosen one. The index acted like an iron curtain around knowledge. It did not merely prevent access to information, it shaped the imagination itself. If a story could not be read, it could not be discussed, questioned, or incorporated into memory. Generations grew up believing Judas had always been the villain, because the church had systematically removed any competing narratives. Hidden texts, forbidden teachings, and apocryphal gospels were consigned to silence. Reading them was considered a crime, curiosity became dangerous, and the mind was fenced in by decree. Inquisitions reinforced this control. Across Europe, tribunals investigated, interrogated, and punished those who dared possess prohibited books. Monks, scholars, and ordinary citizens faced imprisonment, torture, and even death for challenging the narrative. To possess an alternative gospel, or even to speak of one, was to risk your life. And so, silence became survival. Parents warned children, schools avoided controversial texts, and libraries refused certain manuscripts. The story of Judas was locked into a single frame: betrayal, greed, and eternal condemnation. The effect on imagination was profound. When only one version of a story is allowed to exist, it becomes the only one that can be pictured, painted, or discussed. Artists, writers, and educators internalized the image of Judas as the villain. Even when fragments of alternative narratives survived in hidden collections or remote monasteries, most people never encountered them. Over centuries, the absence of competing voices created a reality in which the imagination itself accepted the official story as fact. The Index and Inquisitions created a long shadow, stretching across centuries. Even after the lists were abolished, their effects persisted. Forbidden texts were scattered, damaged, and difficult to access. The habit of obedience, the fear of heresy, and the cultural memory of punishment continued to enforce the narrative of Judas as the betrayer. Only in modern times, with translations of the Gospel of Judas and rediscovery of other apocryphal texts, has this curtain begun to lift. The lesson is clear. Controlling reading is not merely controlling knowledge, it is controlling how people see the world, what they can imagine, and who they can consider heroes or villains. By restricting access to alternative accounts of Judas, institutions shaped morality, memory, and imagination for generations. And only now, as forbidden texts emerge from shadows, do we begin to understand the depth of that control and the possibility of seeing Judas differently than we ever were allowed to before. Words are more than words. In ancient manuscripts, a single Greek or Coptic term can shape how a story is understood for centuries. A translation can cast Judas as the villain or hint at his role as the chosen one. Philology, the study of language, becomes a battlefield. Footnotes are weapons. Every verb, every tense, every subtle nuance carries the potential to condemn or to redeem. Take the verb that describes Judas's action in the garden. In Greek, the word can mean to hand over, to betray, or to deliver. Scholars argue over which meaning is correct. The canonical Gospels translated it as betrayal, creating a Judas forever bound to guilt. But alternative readings suggest delivery or obedience, which changes everything. Suddenly, the act is no longer malicious but purposeful, a necessary step in a divine plan. The fate of a man depends on how a word is interpreted. The challenge grows when manuscripts are incomplete, damaged, or rewritten. Scribes copied texts by hand, sometimes misreading letters, sometimes adjusting phrases to fit doctrine. Over centuries, these subtle changes accumulate. What may have once suggested that Judas was fulfilling a sacred duty becomes corrupted into evidence of greed and treachery. Translation is not neutral. It is interpretive, and every choice carries consequences for how history remembers a person. Footnotes, often ignored by casual readers, serve as battlegrounds. Editors and translators can include commentary that colours meaning. A note about betrayal can assert certainty where the original text is ambiguous. A note about delivery can suggest hidden knowledge or obedience. Scholars argue for decades, and each decision echoes across classrooms, sermons, and textbooks. The interpretation of one word can shape belief, morality, and institutional authority. Coptic texts, like the Gospel of Judas, make this struggle even more intense. Coptic is a language that evolved from Egyptian hieroglyphs and Greek. Its vocabulary carries layers of cultural and spiritual significance. A phrase describing Judas's act may have multiple meanings depending on context, inflection, or religious symbolism. Choosing one meaning over another is never just a linguistic decision. It is a theological and historical choice. Translation wars are not limited to academic debate. They influence what the public reads and believes. A single mistranslated word can cement a centuries-long reputation. A single careful translation can open new interpretations, restore nuance, and even rehabilitate a figure like Judas. The fight over words is therefore a fight over memory, morality, and authority. When we read these ancient texts, it is essential to remember that language is alive. Each letter carries power, each phrase can shift perspective. The story of Judas shows us that translation is not a neutral act, but a battlefield where words determine the fate of souls, the legacy of history, and the moral imagination of generations. In the hands of translators, a single word can damn or deliver, and the battle over meaning continues even today. The early centuries of Christianity were not uniform. There were many voices, many teachings, many interpretations. Among them were the Gnostics, followers of esoteric knowledge, who believed that salvation came from understanding hidden truths rather than blind obedience. They saw the world differently. The material realm was flawed, the spirit was divine, and knowledge was the key to liberation. On this fault line between exoteric authority and esoteric insight stood Judas, the disciple who understood what others could not, the patron of uncomfortable knowledge. To the mainstream church, Gnostics were dangerous. Their teachings threatened hierarchy, doctrine, and the control of belief. They suggested that ordinary followers could access truth directly, without the mediation of priests or popes. They questioned authority, not out of rebellion, but out of insight. And Judas, in the Gnostic texts, became the ultimate symbol of this challenge. He did what others could not. He embraced knowledge that made him appear guilty, and he carried the burden of revelation. The Gnostic fault line is not just theological, it is psychological and social. Exoteric authority relies on obedience, conformity, and clear moral lines. Esoteric insight thrives on questioning, exploration, and ambiguity. Judas inhabits both worlds. To the church, he is the traitor. To the Gnostics, he is the chosen one, the keeper of secrets, the one willing to face hatred to fulfill the deeper plan. His story embodies the tension between what we are told to believe and what we can understand for ourselves. Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Judas, reveal a different dialogue between teacher and disciple. Jesus speaks in mysteries, guiding Judas to act in ways the others cannot comprehend. The act of betrayal is recast as obedience, as knowledge, as courage. Here, the disciple who bears the burden of understanding is neither villain nor saint in conventional terms. He is the agent of insight, the one who carries the uncomfortable truths that authority wishes to suppress. The fault line extends beyond religion. It exists in every culture that balances control with curiosity. Institutions, whether religious, political, or social, often fear the people who seek hidden truths. These seekers are like Judas, carrying knowledge that makes the comfortable uncomfortable. They are labelled troublemakers, heretics, or outsiders. And yet, without them, progress and understanding would stall. The Gnostic fault line reminds us that knowledge is power, and that those who embrace it may be misunderstood for centuries. Judas, as patron of uncomfortable knowledge, teaches a lesson about courage and perspective. His vilification is not proof of guilt, it is proof of the threat he posed to the dominant narrative. Understanding his role requires looking beyond simple morality, beyond obedience, beyond fear. It requires acknowledging that truth can be hidden in places society deems dangerous, and that sometimes the one who appears guilty is the one who carries the light. On this fault line, history itself is contested. The exoteric teaches one story, comfortable and digestible. The esoteric whispers another, challenging, mysterious, and inconvenient. Judas stands at the intersection, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge often comes at a cost, and that those willing to bear it may forever be misunderstood by the world they aim to enlighten. Throughout history, Control over knowledge has often required more than sermons and manuscripts. It has required timing. Calendars, eclipses, and celestial events have long been used to align belief with authority, to make narratives appear unbreakable. The priest who dictates doctrine and the astronomer who measures the heavens may seem to inhabit separate worlds, but in medieval Europe their stories often ran in parallel, working together to ensure that the story of Judas and all of history remained firmly in place. The Julian calendar, introduced in 45 BCE and later refined into the Gregorian calendar in 1582, was not just a tool for measuring days, it was a framework for authority. By controlling the reckoning of time, the Church could dictate the dates of religious festivals, observances, and historical events. History became aligned with doctrine, and events like the crucifixion were placed precisely to reinforce teaching. Calendars were silent enforcers, making the narrative appear fixed and inevitable. Eclipses and other celestial phenomena served as further instruments of control. When an eclipse was recorded in monasteries or by court astronomers, it was often used to verify the timing of events. But if a celestial event did not align with the accepted story, the astronomer could be pressured to adjust calculations or reinterpret the observation. Knowledge of the heavens was filtered through authority, making the sky itself a tool to reinforce what people were told about Judas and every other historical figure. Priests oversaw doctrine, enforcing orthodoxy through sermons, councils, and inquisitions. Astronomers, many of whom worked under church supervision, calculated the motions of stars and planets with precision, but were expected to ensure their findings did not contradict official narratives. This partnership created a system where time, science, and belief all converged to produce a seamless version of history. To question the story of Judas was to question not only morality, but the very structure of time and cosmos. This alignment made narratives appear unbreakable. When every calendar marked the crucifixion on a certain day, when eclipses were interpreted to confirm the timing of events, and when priests preached the same story year after year, the tale of betrayal became impossible to doubt. Alternative interpretations, like those in the Gospel of Judas, were rendered invisible because the tools of time and observation reinforced orthodoxy. Even the heavens seemed to agree with the verdict, yet cracks existed. Astronomical calculations sometimes contradicted church records. Independent scholars occasionally noticed mismatched dates or unexplained phenomena. These discrepancies were quietly suppressed or ignored, but they remind us that control was not perfect. The priest and the astronomer may have worked to align doctrine and timeline, but history, like the sky, has its own complexities that cannot be entirely contained. The story of Judas demonstrates how institutions can synchronize morality, observation, and time to protect a narrative. Calendars, eclipses, and creeds became instruments of power, ensuring that a single version of events persisted across centuries. And in this carefully orchestrated alignment, the vilified hand, the chosen disciple, and the weight of history itself remained fixed, unchallenged, and unquestioned for generations. Judas has never truly left the story. Even in the modern world, his shadow looms large, appearing in films, sermons, and schoolbooks. Each retelling simplifies, codifies, and repeats the same narrative: betrayal, greed, and eternal damnation. Pop culture has taken the figure of Judas and turned him into shorthand for treachery, a symbol that is instantly recognizable. And in doing so, it reburies any nuance that alternative texts or historical research might uncover. In movies, Judas is often depicted in dramatic lighting, isolated from the others, his face twisted with malice or fear. Directors rely on centuries of interpretation to make the story understandable for audiences in 2 hours or less. Subtle theological debates or the possibility that his actions were necessary are erased. Visual storytelling requires clarity, and the complexity of the Gospel of Judas is simply too inconvenient. Every time a scene is shot, every frame edited, the modern audience is taught again that Judas is the ultimate villain. Sermons continue the tradition. Clergy speak to congregations with confidence, repeating the cautionary tale of the betrayer. Few challenge the narrative, and fewer still discuss alternative gospels. The story of Judas becomes moral shorthand, a convenient way to illustrate obedience, faith, and sin. Parables and lectures echo the ancient verdict, reinforcing the same lessons that have been repeated for centuries. Nuance is sacrificed for impact, and the public mind absorbs the simplified version. Schoolbooks follow suit. Students are introduced to Judas in chapters on the Last Supper and the crucifixion. The lesson is clear, easy to memorize, and moralistically tidy. Historical context, Gnostic perspectives, and alternative readings are omitted. The result is a cycle in which young minds internalize a single story, one in which Judas is fixed in place as a symbol of evil. The canon of textbooks, much like the canonical Gospels, leaves little room for doubt or reinterpretation. Pop culture acts as a loop, a mechanism that repeats and reinforces authority over memory. Every retelling becomes a rehearsal of the same judgment, the same conclusion. Even as scholars translate, study, and publish the Gospel of Judas, the story that reaches the majority of people remains unchanged. The villain is fixed, the narrative simplified, and the possibility of complexity disappears beneath layers of repetition. Yet, there is power in recognizing the loop. When we compare films, sermons, and textbooks with historical and Gnostic texts, the gaps and silences become obvious. The figure of Judas is no longer just a villain. He is a mirror reflecting centuries of institutional control over narrative, morality, and imagination. Pop culture may bury nuance, but it cannot erase curiosity. For those who seek the story behind the story, every movie or lesson becomes a starting point for questioning what was left unsaid, unseen, or intentionally forgotten. Judas in the modern mind is more than a character. He is a measure of how narratives survive, how institutions shape memory, and how simplification becomes the easiest form of control. Every time the story is told for easy catharsis, we are reminded that history is never fixed, and the truth may be waiting for those willing to look beyond the screen, the pulpit, and the page. What if Judas had been loyal? The question seems almost impossible to imagine, yet it opens a world of counterfactual thinking that reshapes everything we take for granted about sin, salvation, and free will. For centuries, believers have relied on Judas as the ultimate cautionary tale, the embodiment of betrayal. But if we recast him as obedient, chosen, and necessary, the moral universe shifts. Suddenly, sin is no longer a simple measure of disobedience, and salvation cannot be defined only by the avoidance of evil. In a loyal Judas reading, betrayal transforms into obedience. The act of handing Jesus over is no longer a crime of greed, but a difficult fulfillment of a divine plan. Judas becomes the disciple who understood the weight of destiny, the one willing to carry out the hardest task. Morality becomes less about following rules and more about comprehension of purpose. The neat lines of guilt and virtue blur, leaving a more complex picture of human action and consequence. Salvation, too, changes in this scenario. If Judas was faithful, then redemption is not merely about avoiding sin, but about recognizing the necessity of difficult acts that serve a larger truth. The faithful are no longer passive observers of morality, but participants in a world where actions carry layers of meaning. Jesus' mission is fulfilled not by simple obedience alone, but by the courage of those who act, even when the world misunderstands them. Judas is no longer a warning, but a guide to understanding, sacrifice, and duty. Free will also becomes more intricate. If Judas chose to obey, despite appearing to betray, then choice is layered. Humans are not simply free to act morally or immorally. They are free to act with understanding. even if that understanding is hidden from the world. The narrative encourages reflection on the difficulty of decision-making when moral clarity is unavailable and the consequences of obedience may appear as wrongdoing. The tension between appearance and reality becomes central to understanding human responsibility. This scenario forces us to examine our own appetite for villains. Cultures rely on clear antagonists to simplify morality, to make stories digestible, and to create a framework in which people can feel secure. But if the ultimate villain of history is recast as necessary, loyal, and wise, we must confront the discomfort of ambiguity. We must ask whether we seek easy answers and whether our judgments of right and wrong are sometimes too simple to capture truth. Considering Judas as loyal invites us to reconsider centuries of moral teaching. It challenges the structures that have dictated who we blame and who we forgive. It reframes historical narratives and religious understanding in ways that emphasize courage, obedience, and the hidden complexity of human action. And it reminds us that villains may sometimes be heroes, and heroes may carry burdens the world cannot immediately recognize. The loyal Judas reading is not just a thought experiment. It is a mirror reflecting our own tendencies to simplify, to judge, and to condemn. By imagining him as faithful, we confront the uncomfortable possibility that morality is rarely black and white, and that understanding, courage, and obedience can appear, at least at first, as betrayal. The story of Judas has been locked away for centuries, not only in books, but in the minds of those who control access to history. Every manuscript, every fragment, every marginal note carries meaning. Yet most remain hidden behind vaults and gates. The time has come to open these doors, to make public everything about Judas, from drafts to annotated copies, because faith without truth is theatre, a performance in which the audience is blind to the script. Transparency is not optional. If the Gospel of Judas and related texts are genuine, they hold insights into morality, destiny, and human understanding that have been obscured for generations. Scholars, theologians, and curious minds deserve the opportunity to study them fully. Marginalia, notes in the margins that show how scribes wrestled with meaning, are just as important as the main text. They reveal thought processes, debates, and interpretations that illuminate the history of belief and the treatment of Judas as both villain and chosen one. Opening the vault challenges centuries of secrecy. It exposes the decisions that shaped morality and memory, showing how institutions selected which stories to preserve and which to suppress. When manuscripts are hidden, the narrative becomes narrow, controlled, and incomplete. When they are revealed, the public can see complexity, ambiguity, and courage that has long been erased. A full picture of Judas cannot exist without access to every page, every note, and every draft. Faith thrives on understanding, not ignorance. For too long, believers and non-believers alike have relied on a partial story of Judas, repeated in sermons, textbooks, and popular media. The result is a moral framework built on simplification, a story that rewards obedience and condemns curiosity. Opening the vault would allow the world to engage with the text directly, to wrestle with its meaning, and to see that truth is rarely simple. It would shift faith from performance to participation, from passive acceptance to active comprehension. The act of publishing everything is also a safeguard against distortion. When only a few have access to a text, interpretation can be manipulated, misreadings can solidify into dogma, and alternate perspectives can be erased. Making all materials available ensures that the story of Judas is studied, debated, and understood in its full context. Readers could see how scribes interpreted divine instruction, how they handled the tension between loyalty and appearance, and how history itself was shaped by human hands. Opening the vault is a call to courage. It asks institutions to relinquish control, to trust that humanity can handle complexity, and to embrace a version of faith that does not rely on secrecy. Every marginal note, every draft, every hidden manuscript carries lessons not just about Judas, but about morality, obedience, and the human appetite for understanding. Faith without truth is theatre, but faith grounded in knowledge allows insight, reflection, and real engagement. The time has come to lift the veil, to place every text on Judas in the light of day, to allow scholars and the public to read, question, and interpret without restriction. In that openness lies not chaos, but understanding. In that transparency lies the chance to see Judas not just as villain or saint, but as a figure whose story can teach us how history, faith, and courage intersect when we finally confront the truth. 30 pieces of silver. The story has repeated these words for centuries, a simple sum attached to a simple verdict, betrayal counted and measured. But what if those coins were not simply payment for wrongdoing? What if each piece represents a question we are meant to ask, a spark meant to ignite curiosity rather than judgment? 30 lights, 30 opportunities to look beyond what we have been told and to see the story of Judas in a new way. Each coin becomes a question. Who decides what is sin and what is necessity? What is the difference between appearance and truth? How do we know that our understanding of history is complete, and what might have been edited, lost, or hidden? What does it mean to act with knowledge that others cannot comprehend, and can courage sometimes appear as betrayal? 30 coins, 30 lights, illuminating paths we were taught not to walk. Curiosity is the companion of these lights. They challenge the comfort of certainty, asking us to examine the foundations of morality, faith, and obedience. What if our teachers, our books, our traditions have all simplified the story to make it easier to digest? What if the villain is also the hero, and the acts we condemn are acts of obedience or understanding beyond our immediate perception? Each light asks us to question, to explore, to acknowledge complexity rather than demand simplicity. The 30 lights also shine on institutions, on power structures that have controlled narrative for centuries. Why was Judas cast as the eternal traitor? Who benefited from a story that offered clarity over nuance? What was hidden in archives, in marginalia, in forbidden texts? The lights invite us to peer behind vaults, to consider the fragments that survived in silence, and to confront the fear that those in authority have of revealing what they know. Looking at Judas through these 30 lights is an act of courage. It asks us to resist the easy narratives repeated in schoolbooks, sermons, and films. It encourages us to read, to compare, to notice subtle signals in texts and art, to pay attention to translation, context, and intention. It invites us to acknowledge that history is messy, that morality is layered, and that human actions cannot always be neatly categorized. The final meditation of the 30 lights is an invitation. Trade certainty for curiosity, judgment for inquiry, fear for understanding. Allow yourself to ask questions that may have been discouraged or dismissed. Follow the paths that tradition told you were dangerous, and look where others have chosen not to see. In doing so, the story of Judas becomes alive again, not a cautionary tale of betrayal, but a guide to navigating complexity, courage, and the pursuit of truth. 30 coins, 30 questions, 30 lights. Let them illuminate not just the story of Judas, but the way we approach history, faith, and knowledge itself. Curiosity, not condemnation, becomes the key. And as we look into the shadows, into vaults, and into the gaps of the narrative, we may find the truths that were always meant to challenge us, to guide us, and to remind us that the light is often hidden where we least expect it.